Hey everybody, we're going to start a new project. I've still got the Suburban truck project going on. We're about to finally start doing some performance stuff to it. But I've picked up this Explorer to get me around. In the meantime, this is a 97 Ford Explorer. It has the V6, unfortunately not the powerful V6. It has the regular overhead valve, but it's a control track four-wheel drive, which is pretty cool. The thing is low miles and in really good shape. Only got 135,000 on it. All the interior's really nice. It's just dirty. So I've got new buttons on the way. Kind of a weird thing going on here with the sun fading. But yeah, two owner car before I got it. Everything works. So the tape deck you can see is busted up there, but it's got a lot of really cool options from the factory. So since this thing is four-wheel drive, it needs to be lifted up. That's one of the things we're going to do first. The rear leaf springs are sagging pretty bad. So I've got new rear leaf springs coming. And then we're going to do a 2 to 3 inch lift all the way around. Torsion keys in the front, add a leaf, and brand new springs in the rear. I'm going to totally rebuild the front end, ball joints, tie rods, all that good stuff. So all that will get done. And then we're also going to do some stuff maintenance-wise. I already put some new lift struts on it this morning because those things were toast. And it has a new alternator and a new battery. Those were done before I got it. We're going to do a new serpentine belt. I already did new pulleys. I just put a bearing in that pulley, but the other one, the tensioner pulley, I had to replace because you can't get the bearing out of that plastic pulley. So I did those. Then we'll do spark plugs. And the biggest thing is going to be a transmission fluid service. So with 135,000 on it, I know it hasn't been done. It definitely needs to. And yeah, this is it. It's going to be really cool. I've got all the suspension and the shocks on the way. Finding the right shocks for this thing were kind of a pain. There's like 3 different suspension models you can get, and they're all a little bit different. So I ended up going with Skyjackers, and I'll put the model number to the shocks in the link. I'll put a link to the shocks in the description. So if you're working on one of these, I've already done all the legwork for you. They were really hard to find the right ones. But yeah, this is it. It's going to turn out to be pretty cool, I think, and we're going to do some videos on the way. Well, we've got our first upgrade going on to the Explorer here. I've already got the front end rebuilt with tie rods, ball joints, all that good fun stuff, and also wheel bearings. So what I'm going to show you today is how to do a front and rear lift kit. So all the videos online are only showing the rear, and they usually do it with like shackles. So the rear of this truck is already sagging pretty bad. I'm going to go ahead and replace the leaf springs with brand new factory leaf springs, and then do an add a leaf to raise it up a little bit higher than that. What I'm going to do for the front is torsion keys. You can just crank the torsion keys up, or you can actually replace them for lift keys, which is what we're going to do. With these Explorers, you run into a problem because the front end cannot travel very far before the front CV axle starts to bind up. So let's see. There you go. There's that front CV axle, and it is at a pretty extreme angle right now. So you can actually, if you loosen the shock up, which I have this one loose, and drop it all the way down, it'll bind up so bad that you can't even turn it. So right now I'm trying to turn this axle and I can't. So you want to avoid any kind of extended shocks. Luckily for you, they don't make extended shocks with these things. They've got this weird little strut right here where most shocks have a full-length body that goes all the way down. The full-length bodies will actually hit the CV axle. So I've tried them. I know they don't work. But you don't want to have any added shock travel, otherwise you'll put your suspension in a bind. You can only get about 2 inches on these before you run into problems. So the shocks will actually keep you out of trouble. These are just some brand new KYBs, nothing really special. You can see new A-arms and all that kind of stuff. So what you're going to need for this job is a set of torsion keys. They're the same for Ford Rangers and a bunch of other stuff, but that's what it looks like. And you're going to need a torsion key tool or a torsion key preload tool. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to show you the way to do it without that tool, because the one that I have doesn't work for this design. It's for GM. Over here you can see the factory key underneath. I've got a bunch of these things laying around, and you can see that it's not the same here. So this one is going to be canted a little bit more like that, and that's where we're going to get our lift from. So we've got our torsion key here. You're going to need definitely a really good jack to do this method without the special tool. And then we're going to have to pop our shock down and a couple other things to make it just a little bit easier. So let me go ahead and show you underneath here kind of how this works. All right, so there is the torsion key and the torsion bar and the adjusting bolt. So there's a cover that goes right here. It has 4 bolts, 1, 2, and then 3, 4. The cover is off. Those are 1/2 inch. And the torsion bar torsion key just rests up in this little socket. So what you're going to do is you need to take off the preload here, and the way that you can do it is we're going to use a jack with a small socket. This one happens to be 5/16, or you can use something similar that fits up in the little pocket of the torsion key there. And we're just going to take the load off of it, and then we're going to zip this out. I've got mine soaking in penetrating fluid. Sometimes they'll have Loctite on them, like blue Loctite. So yeah, let's get this thing zipped apart. Since we're doing this without the torsion bar tool, you're going to need to take the nuts off the top of the shock here so it can fall down, and then we're going to need to take out the little cross bolt here that clamps in the control arm to the spindle, and it's a 15 millimeter. So once you get that done, you can also take the sway bar bushings off. So I have the sway bar bushings out of the other side. We shouldn't have to do this one since one side is open. So we'll let this guy down here. And knock it loose. That way we can get that extra bit of travel when we need to crank that torsion key. So now this thing is released so far down that the axle is in a bind, and we can't even turn this thing at all. We'll get the jack set up here, and we'll go ahead and take the tension off the torsion key. Alrighty, we're under the car now, and I'm going to see if I can unload the pressure on this torsion key with this little socket. See if it'll go up inside that slot there. Need to support it just enough. Sometimes you might have to use a longer socket, but we want to stay as short as possible. And we'll take our 1/2 inch on the impact here. Okay, there we go. So you can tell all the preload is taken off of the torsion bar because this little guy's flopping all around. Go ahead and take this out. Just kind of set it in there. Okay, make sure everything is fully supported with jack stands, because now we're going to actually start unloading the torsion bar here, and it is under spring pressure. Alright. Sometimes this thing will just come right off. Sometimes you got to use some penetrating fluid and a little persuasion. No big deal. So the factory one has this little isolator here on top. The aftermarket ones don't, and in my experience you can't ever really reuse these. You can see this one's worn all the way down to the metal, so it doesn't really matter anyway. Next up, you need to get some grease, and there are 2 spots you'll want to put grease. First one is up inside this socket here on the frame, so we'll grease that there. And then next up on your torsion key, I'm going to put grease on this section here. That'll just help the little socket that we're going to use to press up in there, not to bind up. Alright, you can see there's much more of an angle on this thing than the factory one had. So all that grease smeared around in there, and then we can take our socket and get it lined up. You want to make sure your jack can roll forward if you're using a floor jack. So have the wheels oriented with it already moving forward, because the jack's going to need to move a little bit, just kind of with the geometry of the thing. Alright, now we've got it in place. What we want to do is lift it up enough so that we can get this little guy up underneath that. So as I'm jacking on it, you'll see this start to go up and hopefully free up a little spot where we can see inside there. You want your jack to be as far this way as possible. Otherwise, when you start jacking up on it, you'll hit this bar and lift up the whole vehicle. So let me start bringing it up and see if we can get it in place. This is where taking the spindle loose up front is going to come in handy, because we'll be able to really crank this thing down. We probably won't get our proper lift until we almost start to get the back tire off the ground. Getting pretty close. Alright, I think we're just about there. This is the part you want to be just extremely careful, don't bump anything, because this is the part where you could die. There we go. We've got our little hangy thing in place. We'll tighten this up. And I'm going to go ahead and get this pretty tight down here with the impact. And we can always unload it as we need to level the vehicle out. Since we're only going after 2 inches, we can start with a little bit higher, and then once we get the weight on the vehicle, we can back this thing. Got that thing cranked in. I'm going to go ahead and lower the vehicle back onto the jack stands, which are up front. And this is, I'm almost certain, way too much on the torsion key adjuster. But like I said, if we crank it all the way up now, we can just loosen it while the vehicle's on the ground. And we can go back up front here. Now we'll need the jack, because we'll have to lift up on the A-arm just to get everything back together. It's under quite a bit of tension now. Alright, loosen that adjuster quite a lot. Just gotta kind of finagle this thing in there. Almost there. I'm going to get some pressure on it while I tap. There we go. Now I can zip this guy back together. Okay, and next up we can get the shock bolts back in. Alright, jack that up just so it touches. Get our bushing. Now the shock should keep the axle from hyperextending, which it does, so it's in place. We can go ahead and get this wheel back together. I'll put the other side back together, and then we'll adjust the torsion key preload until we have 2 inches of lift. All right, well, the torsion keys are installed, and I've got them dialed in to what feels the best. So, in the beginning, from the center of the wheel to the wheel arch was 20 5/8 inches, and now we're right at 22 inches, and that's what feels the best while riding. I had them cranked in quite a bit, just about all the way, and it was absolutely just too much. So I don't really know that these keys are necessary. I think if you want to lift your Explorer, you can just crank up the factory keys depending on how much adjustment that you have. For this particular truck, with those KYB shocks, 22 inches is about as far as I'm willing to go for ride comfort. Any more than that, and it was just so incredibly stiff, you could tell the suspension was trying to pull the shock apart. So you weren't actually having any weight even on the shock at all. The torsion bar was just prying all the way out against it. So you may be able to get away with a little bit longer shocks. I don't know where you would find those. I've looked up every part number and I can't find any that work. But that's about what the threads look like on mine. You can see there's a very small amount poking out there on the top. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see how these go. I really think factory torsion keys cranked up is probably a better option, and it's going to be a whole lot less work than going through all this. So next up we'll do the rear, get those leaf springs swapped out, and the add-a-leaf and the new shocks. So the front lift is pretty much done on the Explorer here. Now it's time to go ahead and do the rear. We'll go around the side here and you can see really how much of a difference there is in the lift. You can see it better at this angle. So my driveway is kind of sloped downhill, but still you can see how much that front end is lifted up. And the back end was already sagging really bad before I started all of this. I think they must have loaded it down a lot in the rear or done something to destroy those springs. So what I've got here is 2 brand new factory springs. Well, one's already been modified, but these are factory springs from SD Truck Springs. There's 2 different types for this truck, over the axle and under the axle. So as you can see here, we've got the under the axle springs, and I've already installed an add-a-leaf on one of them. So here's the add-a-leaf kit. It's just a cheap one I got on eBay. There's a little sticker that came with Spring Force. So it came with this hardware and one of these leaves here. So you can see the taller leaf right here has already had the add-a-leaf installed. I'll show you how to do that. It's really not too difficult as long as you've got a couple tools. So it looks like this add-a-leaf raised the unloaded spring pack height. This is 8 1/8 inches, and that's 10 1/8. So it's raised it up 2 inches unloaded. The add-a-leaf is a pretty stiff unit, so I don't know actually how much lift we're going to gain here, but we're going to go from the center of the wheel to the wheel arch here instead of going from the ground. And we're at 18 1/8 inches. So we'll get this thing installed. I'll video adding the new leaf to the leaf pack here, and then we'll get it installed in the truck. So the reason I did the brand new leaf springs was just because of how much sag the truck had beforehand. I think if I would have put the add-a-leaf on, it would have just raised it up to factory height, and that's not what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and get started on disassembling this leaf pack and getting the new spring in. Alrighty, we're going to get this new leaf pack modified with the add-a-leaf. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this. Different methods of taking things apart and stuff. We're just going to use the vise because it's here and it's pretty sturdy. It's going to make things easy. So I just tightening down on the head of the stud that's poking out on the bottom. And then for this one, looks like it's a 5/8, and Yep, there you go. That one's a 5/8. What we want to do before we get everything loosened up is put some clamps on the springs to keep everything from coming apart. I'm just going to use this small C-clamp here and put it right past the overload spring there on the bottom. You want to take your add leaf and just make sure it's not going to interfere. So that one's far enough away. And I broke my other C-clamp recently. So we're just going to use a welding clamp here on this side. Alright, that'll keep everything together. Make sure nothing's going to be in the way. This bolt is actually long enough to clear this new add leaf, but putting it back together the way I'm going to do it is pretty difficult. Getting it compressed and aligned, so we're going to use the new bolt, or one of the new bolts that the add leaf kit came with, and then we'll just chop it off at the end. And you'll see why here in just a minute. We're going to have to compress the add leaf because it is not the same curvature as our springs right here. You can see just this curve here exceeds this whole curve right here. So we're going to have to put this thing in place and then flatten it out. Once we've got this nut off, we can go ahead and remove the top leaves from the overload. There we go. And then what we would do is, if we were going to reuse this bolt, or if it was long enough, stick this guy on place and then stick our leaf pack on there. But since this has such a curve, it's just not going to work. We're going to have to go ahead and use the longer bolt. And I'm just going to get everything loosely set up and tighten it down, and then we'll rearrange everything because we're going to have to clamp this spring pack down. So as you can see there's a pretty big gap that we've got to compress, and I don't think the hardware here is going to be strong enough to do that. So let me go grab a washer. I'm going to stick a washer on there first. Actually, you know what? No, we're not. If we put a washer on that, it may not clear the little recessed hole that it has to go into in the axle. So we'll just leave it like this. Alright, now we're not going to use the hardware to compress everything. I'm just going to kind of preload it here. That way it doesn't wiggle all around when I try to clamp it in the vise here in a minute. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to put too much stress on those threads because I don't know how good the quality is in this hardware. Alright. Now this is the part that's a little bit difficult. You've got to at least have a couple of muscles to do this job here. So what we're going to have to do is hold the spring in position while we tighten the vise on it. So we got to open it up a little bit more. There we go. So I'm going to let it rest on the head of the bolt back there, so I'm not having to manhandle this thing the whole way. And then I'll just lift it up a hair and tighten it down. I want to be able to get a vice grip on the back of that head. So we'll just make sure everything is pretty close to being as lined or as close as we can get here. And then just start cranking down the vise. It's pretty tough. You definitely want to have a big vise. I don't know if you're going to be able to do this on one of the little 3-inch units. Maybe if you're stronger than me, I guess. Probably could. Alright, so we want to get it compressed as much as possible, and then we should be able to finish off any gap just by tightening this bolt up. Okay, this is as compressed as I can get it. If you want to use the original bolt, you can, but sometimes once this thing is finally collapsed where it needs to be, it can be really difficult to get everything aligned. So this new hardware is a little bit smaller diameter. I don't know if we'll be able to get this bolt back in. If we can, I'd like to use it. Yeah, it's just not going to work. I've tried tapping these leaves around before in different ways, and it just never seems to work out. So we'll just get this nut zipped down here. And we'll stick a pair of vice grips on the back. Sometimes they'll have a little slot for a flathead screwdriver. This one doesn't. And this new bolt is a 9/16. Let's see if I left myself. Nope, I didn't leave enough room for the ratcheting head. I'm trying to keep my arms out of the frame so you can see what's going on. So you'll just watch here on the side, make sure all the gap is taken out, and then give it a little bit extra. Okay, now our new leaf pack is ready to be installed on the truck. Unfortunately, the wind is really bad out here, so I'm not going to be able to video this process without bursting everyone's eardrums. So I'm just going to show you what to do. You're going to need 13/16 or 18 millimeter is better if you have it. And that's going to be the main tool you use to take everything apart. You've got that cross bolt back there, one in the front. You don't have to disconnect the sway bar. And you've got these 4 bolts underneath here. Shock mount there on the bottom. It's an 18 and a 15. And then the shock mounts on the top are a 13. And they're pretty difficult to get to. So that's where the shock goes, but you have to get to the bolts from the top. So see the way these little guys are made? I had to press these ears out of the old shocks and press the studs out and then reassemble it on the new Skyjacker shocks. These shocks are like 3 or 4 inches longer than the other ones, so but yeah, anyway, these are pretty difficult to get to. You really need a flex head ratcheting wrench, that one on the far left, the 13 millimeter, to get those bolts out of the top there. So we'll wait to the end to get those installed. But yep, so take those bolts out of there. Then you can remove this plate and the U-bolts. Then you want to put your jack where that was, right underneath here, and take the tension off before you remove the shackle bolt in the rear and the other pivot bolt there in the front. Then you can lower the whole spring down and toss it out. Assembly is going to be just the reverse. It should be pretty easy. Get your spring underneath there. Maybe if you can, put in the rear or front shackle bolt and lift it up with a jack and get your U-bolts on. So I'm going to get all this back together. I wish I could video this process, but I'm having to cover up the microphone right now because it is so windy out here. So anyway, let me get this back together and we'll have the finished product. All right, we've got the rear leaf springs on with the AWD leaf and the new shocks. So I put some Skyjacker shocks there in the back. And right now it sits 1 inch lower in the back. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and pick up some lift shackles for the back just to raise it up, because I'd like the rear to be at least 1 inch higher than the front. Right now the front is sitting about 21 1/4, and the rear is sitting 20 1/4. So we definitely gained a whole lot of lift, 2 inches from before when those springs were sagging. But it looks good. It all went together pretty easily. So next up, I'm gonna get some shackles on there and we'll raise this thing up to hopefully its final height. I wanna show you something that I did in the front. So I talked about not using shock stud extenders because you don't want to let the A-arm travel too far down because the axle will get in a bind. But what I ended up doing was I just cut a little piece of collar. So this is 1/4 inch tubing. And I cut just enough to where I still have plenty of flex up and down, but the axle doesn't get in a bind. So I may play with this idea a little bit and just see how far I can go, because the shock is what limits the A-arm actually from going too far in this setup. So I may see just how far we can go, and then I'll let you guys know probably in a video update, or I'll update the description later on. But I'm gonna pick up some lift shackles, and then after that we'll be ready for some tires. I think what I'm gonna go with is 31 10.5 15s if I stick with the stock tire size. So yep, there we go. Well, here's the final update on the Ford Explorer build. So we've got everything settled in and completely lifted up. You can see we went a little bit bigger with the tires than I wanted. These are 33 12.5s. And I was planning on going 31 10.5s. So I had to remove the factory running boards because when turning they would rub. So I put these steps on here and they work out well. I did have to cut a tiny bit of the fender, you can see here. And then I just had to remove some of the plastic in the front so it's not level with the bumper anymore. But yep, really not too big of a deal. They are Pro Comp wheels. They're 8 inches wide if I can remember correctly, and they have a little bit better offset. You can see it's got a pretty good stance to it. I did end up installing shackles on the rear here, and these are just the cheap ones that you get from the auto parts store, which is cool. So I ordered a set of the Warrior shackles that are over $100, and they came in and they were the exact same size as these, and these cost $12. So these things are awesome. I've used them plenty of times. I guess if you were really worried about it, you could weld a bar in between here once you get it set, but I'm not worried about it. But yeah, this thing rides really good. With the AWDs, it did take a little bit away from the lift since these leaf springs go under the axle. And they definitely stiffened it up. When this thing's fully loaded, it rides fantastic. We've done a couple of road trips, and I've been daily driving this thing for a good while, since the project started actually. But that's pretty much how it looks, and it turned out really good. It is going to go to its new home, which is the owner of TX Arms here in Fort Worth. A good buddy of mine owns a gun store over there, and he needs something sort of like a Ford Ranger that he can drive around and go to the gun shows and stuff like that. So this is going to work out for him, and it was a fun project. So if you have any questions about lifting one of these things, put it in the comments. I know I can definitely help you out. There's not a whole lot of info about these things. Most of them pertain to like the solid axle trucks. But moving on to the next project.